In the last phase of our project, we used HTML just to build a page template that we could use to make other pages for our website once it's ready. In this exercise, we're going to continue that work, and our goal is going to be to use CSS to be able to style this so that it looks a little bit more interesting. But before we can really do that, we have to do a little bit more to the HTML. So some of this might feel new to you if it wasn't covered in the tutorial, but I'm going to walk you through how to do all of it. What we're looking at here is what your template should look like to this point. So we can see that we have a title for the page, and the only place that shows up is in the browser tab here. I have to extend the page for you to really be able to see it because I've got other tabs open. Let's see. So here we see the beginning of that page title here. And we discussed how that shows up when people are looking for something online and your page shows up in the search results. So that's the reason that we want to have that. But other than that, everything in the head code doesn't display anywhere that we can see on the page, but it's really important because it describes the page. Now, everything that we can see on the page itself appears in the body element. And so what we have in the body element is a header that contains a navigation bar. And then we've got a main element that contains all of the content for the page. In this case, it's placeholder content, but it provides some tips for working with HTML and for writing good content for the web. And then there's a footer element with our secondary navigation, and it has some active links already. Anything that we can already link to should be active, so our sitemap should be active, and our validation links should be active as well. So for the next phase, we're going to do a little bit more to the HTML just to be able to have some of the things that we need to be able to get more creative with the CSS. So for example, we're going to find some typefaces that we can use, including one really popular icon font called Font Awesome. And we're also going to add some things that we can use for what we would call handles for CSS. And so we're just going to add a little bit to the HTML that allows us to more easily target specific things with CSS. This isn't going to look that much different when we're done, but it's going to be a lot easier for us to work with for the CSS. So let's go ahead and start by doing some file management. So far we've been working in the top level of our GRD 188 folder, and ideally what's going to be happening as we do that is we're building out in our public space. If we go straight to our subdomain at cpccagd.com, we're building right in here. So everything in our 188 folder should actually match here, and I shouldn't see a 188 folder on our hosting space. That's just where we're keeping everything locally. And you can see right now that everything somewhat matches. But now we need to do a little bit of preemptive work. So what we're going to do, since we're going to be making some pretty big changes to the template, is we're going to make a backup of that template so that we have something to roll back to if for some reason we break it and we can't fix it. So I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to name this portfolio-html. And all this is going to be is a backup of the work that I've done so far, which is really just to the template page. So I could copy the template page and then paste that copy into portfolio-html. And after that, I'm not going to mess with this folder. I'm just doing it to have a place where my most recent template is backed up so that I don't have to worry so much about making mistakes, and I can just worry about learning as I'm going. So that's going to be the first phase of starting our project. From here, we're going to continue working in our 188 folder on this template that we've been working on already. So we're not going to really change any part of our workflow. It's just that now we have this backup in there that we can use if we need to. Now that we've done that, we need to also create an additional folder that's going to hold our style sheet, our CSS. And this is a concept in web known as separation of concerns. And what that means is kind of a sophisticated way just to say to keep your different kinds of code separate. And so what we want to do is have a folder where we can keep our CSS. I am just going to name it CSS, all lowercase. And you can see that that's getting added in Sublime Text as I'm working. So what I can do now is come to my Sublime Text and just do a Command N on a Mac, Control N on a PC for a new file. And I don't need to put anything in here just yet. I'm just going to do a Save As command and make sure I navigate to my CSS folder. And I'm going to name this styles.css. So now all I'm looking to have right here is just a file called styles.css. It's empty, but for now that's going to work for us. And then I'm going to create one more folder, and I'm going to call it downloads. And in this, I'm going to put a placeholder PDF. It can be a completely empty PDF. It doesn't have to have any content at all. But if you do happen to have a resume, you may want to go and grab the PDF of that resume. So for mine, I do have a resume I can use. So I'm going to navigate to the folder where I'm keeping that and just copy it. And come back to my downloads folder and paste it in there. And you want to name this in a way that if someone were to download it, they would still know what it was. So you could call it whatever you want. You can see here that I've called this one using my first and last name and then a title that would be appropriate. So you could follow this nomenclature, or you could, if you wanted to be more brief about it, you could do first initial, last name, and resume. And that wouldn't be a bad idea either. It'd be better to be a little bit more descriptive, but this is at least better than nothing. And in some cases I could see where it might be good to do this, because that way a hiring manager who downloads it might, forget everyone's names that they're looking at. But if it has the word resume in it, it'd be easier for them to open that file. So anyway, now that we've got our file structure set up, we can start updating our HTML to include it. Before I do that, I'm going to do just a little bit of housekeeping. I no longer need this Sublime test and test.html file, so I'm going to delete those. File management is really important when you're working on the web. It's just a good way to make sure that you don't end up with multiple copies of things and then you don't know which one is the most recent. You might end up making changes to one that is older, and it can start to cause a lot of issues. So once you get to a point where you don't need a certain file, especially in your website, it would be a really good idea to delete it, or at least create a folder for archives, kind of like what we've done here, and put things in there so that you don't have to worry about having multiple copies floating around. The next thing you want to do before you get started here is just to make sure that your template passes validation. So we talked about how you can either have that on your hosting space where you can click the button, or you can validate locally just by copying all of your code and then opening that in the browser and clicking on the HTML validation link. For a local file, it will not validate because it does not know how to get to the file, but it can get you to the validation service, and you can then validate through direct input. And you just want to make sure that you get this green bar. Go through and correct any errors that you see, and then that'll make it a lot easier for you to find errors in your latest work, because if you begin with a file that validates, then you know everything you did up till this point is correct. If you get errors, it's just easier to zero in on where those errors are. So the next thing that we need to do is just go ahead and start working on making our updates. We'll do that in a separate video, but what we're going to do next is start looking at different typefaces that we can use.